All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our session. We are going to talk about climate change and response and some local government case studies about what cities and counties across Florida are doing. And the case study that we're really going to focus on this afternoon is Monroe County in the Florida Keys, and we are very lucky to have Rhonda Haig with us. She is the Chief Resilience Officer for Monroe County, which is facing some very unique challenges, but rising to the occasion in terms of planning and response. And so I'm going to go ahead and now turn it over to Rhonda, and then I will follow up with a presentation. And then Kent Edwards from the City of Delray Beach will go ahead and kind of tie this all together for us in some concluding remarks. And so take it away, Rhonda.
Okay, thank you, Erin. Go ahead and share my screen. This is Rhonda Haig. I'm Rhonda Haig, the Chief Resilience Officer with Monroe County, also known as the fabulous Florida Keys. And let me grab my screen here real quick. Okay, are you seeing that?
Nope, not yet.
Okay.
But I also just sent you a notification to make you a co-host as well. So you should be able to.
Let me try that again. There we go. Okay. Go ahead and get started. How about now?
Yeah, now we got it. Perfect.
All right.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. Okay. So we have a lot to talk about today. So of course, as I said, we're the fabulous Florida Keys, and we have a lot of cool things going on down here. Of course, as an island community that's, over 100 miles along, and most of our roads are at or near sea level, you would think that we might have to prepare for the future and with the rising tides, and that's exactly what we're doing. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what we're doing with the Roadway Vulnerability study and how that's going in some other areas. So we've been at this for a decade now. We here in the Keys knew that we are very vulnerable to sea level rise and the effects of climate change, and therefore we had to prepare a long time ago and get all of our data filled so that when we got to the point where we're ready for some really big infrastructure changes, we have all our T's crossed and our I's dotted. So we're going to talk about our roads vulnerability project, how we got to the 25% and of roadway segments. You're going to see some really cool stuff. And then our relationship between policy and what we're going to do if we can't afford to elevate all of the roads. So our presentation is going to talk about our roads vulnerability project and how our policy relationships at the end of the project is going to help us develop and implement our roads presentation and our roads program. So the goals, why are we doing this roadway vulnerability study, is to help make the Keys more able to withstand sea level rise. In other words, make sure we're here for a while. You can see from these photos, this is what it already looks like in our king tide seasons, where we have several inches or a foot or more of water on many of our neighborhood roads during the October and November king tide seasons. And so this is not something people want to live with. This is not something that's going to help, Monroe be here long term. So the whole road program study is to help us be more resilient for many years into the future and help maintain access to our homes and businesses so you don't have to wade through water like you see Erin and this gentleman here doing, and help protect our property values. So now we have an issue here. So the location here is the study incorporates the entire unincorporated area of Monroe Keys, of Monroe County, as you can see here. So it doesn't include any of our 5 municipalities. Hopefully we'll have our municipalities join us later on this year. Hopefully we're trying to help them join us. But for now, we're only talking about the 311 miles of roads in unincorporated Monroe County. And so we've done a lot, as you heard me say at the beginning, we've done a lot of planning to date, because when you have a big infrastructure program in front of you, like a roads elevation program, you have to make sure you've done all of your planning so that you've identified your vulnerabilities, and you have to make sure you're spending your very limited and very precious resources where you want them to be spent in the most efficient and effective manner. So back in 2016, we launched our Green Keys Resilience Program. That was a 5-year work plan with 165 recommendations. We're still in the midst of that, even though it's been 5 years. And some of these recommendations including, let's do a pilot roads project, because we've never elevated roads here in the Keys. We're all at ground level here. And before we, move forward with what might be $1 billion or more program, you have to figure out what a pilot road elevation projects look like, and to test what the engineering might look like, roadways and costs and things like that. So that was the recommendations for that. Have to improve our elevation data. Can't elevate roads if you don't know exactly how high they are. And that's why we looked at that. And then engineering level analysis, and then all kind of other things of vulnerability recommendations. And then part of that, and we moved on once we got the Green Keys plan up and running and we're doing all of our data collection. We looked at amending our comprehensive plan, and we added in an energy and climate element to that. And then our pilot roads elevation actually came to fruition. They went to design, and that design is now wrapping up. We haven't started construction yet. Mobile LiDAR elevation data, we actually completed that recently. And the reason we can't use aerial LiDAR data when we're looking at these big types of road elevation projects, it's not as accurate. Mobile LiDAR is much more accurate. We have a lot of other things we've done. We've done a lot of grants for our oceanfront parks, for our retirement community, Bayshore Manor, and a lot of other things. So you can see we've done a lot over the years. And then what we're looking at now, is what's in process is our roads adaptation plan, which I'm going to talk to you about today. Vulnerability assessment, which we just completed, and which we're also underway now with a new phase, since we have the Resilient Florida program that has some new requirements, and we're already underway with that. We have new comprehensive plan updates underway, Peril of flood, adaptation action areas, which I think you're going to hear Aaron talk about a little after me, and then some pending grants. So we have a lot of projects. We have a couple of our road elevation, our pilot road grants out for hoping to get money for those in the Key Largo area and the Big Pine area. We applied for a grant to help our municipal partners with their road elevation planning. And of course, we can't forget the natural areas. And so what we're using here when we're looking at doing these road elevation planning, you have to start somewhere. And so that is, you start with the projections. What are you anticipating in terms of sea level rise? And of course, we're using those from the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Compact. They updated their projections in 2019, excuse me, and we're using you see that red highlight there, the NOAA Intermediate High. Not only is that a good one to recommend for these type of long-term infrastructure projects, but it's also required by the state now under their Resilient Florida program as the mandatory line to use. So when we're looking at vulnerability study in the Keys and how much road water is going to be on the road, when you start from the year 2020, you look in another 15, 20 years down the road, we're looking at 13 inches of water on the road. So that's over a foot of water. Then you look to the year 2060, you're looking at another 11 inches. So now you're already talking a couple feet. And then if you jump to the year 2100, you'll add another 43 inches. That's if these projections come true. If all these global efforts to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions aren't successful and we continue to have, glaciers melt and seas rise, we're looking at 6 feet of increase in waters over the next 80 years. Now, if you're 6'4", you can say water's going to come up to your eyeballs. If you're under 6 feet tall, it's going to be over your head. So that gives you an amount, kind of an idea of how much water that can be anticipated. And when you're talking in island communities that are at or near sea level already, that's a lot of water to deal with. But we have plans. So here, it kind of shows you what the differences look like in actuality. So here, this is a year 2035. You can see this is with sea level rise and king tides in the fall. We're looking at 2 feet of water on the roads during the king tide season. Then if you jump to the year 2045, it goes up to 2.5 feet. And you jump to the year 2060, you're now looking at a yardstick. That's a lot of water on the roads, and not something that we want to deal with. So we're looking at this long-term road elevation planning. You have to, go out quite a way so that you prepare your roads so that you don't just build roads to last for 5 or 10 years. You want to build them to last a good 20, 25 years. Okay, so when we looked at this, we looked at our countywide unincorporated roads. There's over 300 miles. And when we looked into we took these sea level rise projections, we says, okay, we know the amount of water that's coming, can be up to our eyeballs in water. What do we need to do to prepare? So we looked at this and we ran it through the engineering crunch. And here by the year 2045, as it turns out, half of our roads, half are going to be subject to some type of inundation on them. So that's 49%. That's 152 miles of roads that are going to need some type of elevation, maybe not all in the elevating the same height, but they're going to need some type of adaptation to keep the water off the road and to help provide resilience. And that 49% of the roads is actually where 71% of the residential units are. So you can see the population is centered in these 50%. Then you jump to the year 2060, we're now looking at 66% of the roads, 206 miles, 200 miles of roads are going to need some type of adaptation by the year 2060, and that's 82% of our population. Then by the year 2100, you can see 252 miles, and which is still not the entire population, so that's the good news, and then 16,000 residential units. So what's the price tag to that? So just to get us through the year 2045, because that's, we don't need to look way in advance. We want to plan for the future, for like the lifespan of a road. So to get us to the year 2045, we're looking at about $1.8 billion. Sounds like a lot, and it is a lot of money, especially for a county of 75,000 residents. But this is things that we're going to have to prepare for, and why you need to do your proper planning, because you want to ensure when we go on the next phase of this project, which is trying to get the funding lined up for this, that we've done all of our proper technical and science planning. And these cost estimates, they don't include things like, if we need to do right-of-way acquisition, when we build roads higher, you have to build them wider oftentimes. And is that going to have to mean we're going to have to buy up right-of-ways? What about driveways? If you build roads higher, driveways have to be higher. All those type of things. Utility poles, we're going to have to elevate them. So there's lots of extra costs that aren't included here. This is really just the basic construction costs and stormwater costs. Okay, so here we are in the roadway vulnerability study. So we've completed our task one. That was really the mobile LiDAR collection. That was $500,000 worth of data, where they went out and got very accurate elevation data for the streets, those 311 miles. Then we handed it over to the engineers, and they took that elevation data, combined it with our sea level rise projections, and did this engineering analysis to help us identify which of these roads we're going to see any type of water on them by the year 2045, and then maybe when would they need to be elevated and how high. And now we're looking at that third phase. Actually, we're going to have a presentation in a couple of weeks to our commission about conceptual development. I'll get into that a little bit later about what that was all about. And then finally, when you have this plan, you heard me say it was $1.8 billion in potential costs. Well, what if we can't afford all that? That's where that task 4 now really becomes important. What's going to be the level of service? Is it going to be different levels of service throughout the keys? If we can't afford to elevate some of the roads that need to be elevated, what are we going to do with those roads? Of course, number 5, stakeholder and public outreach, very important. People drive on these roads every day. They walk out to their mailboxes to get the mail every day. They walk their dogs every day. It's going to be a different look to the roads for those that get elevated. Is it going to be the same type of walkability and things like that? And then finally, task 6 is we're actually in the next 3-4 months, we'll be wrapping it up, is the implementation plan. So it's a very interesting and unique type of project. So what is vulnerability? So when we look at this, vulnerability is really you can think of in terms of the amount of water on the roads and related to that environmental factors, which I'll get into it. Criticality is really what I call the people score, like how does it affect, how critical is it to humans? Like, are there fire stations and things like that on it? So we'll go ahead and dive into that a little bit later. So when we're looking at a vulnerability study, we look at what's a roadway going to look like here if we don't do anything to make them more resilient. And this is a good depiction here. So this is Old State Road in Sugarloaf. So unfortunately, because I don't have the fly-ins, you're just going to jump right to the year 2060 here. But if we don't do anything, you're going to have year-round. You see that bottom level, that's the red, that's sea level rise. So they'll have year-round water on the roads just from sea level rise of about 0.3 feet. And then during the October-November king tide season, you're looking at another 1.4 feet. Of course, that's not even drivable or passable at those time of year, but even during the rest of the year, if there's 3 inches of salt water on the road, that's bad for cars to drive through. Nobody wants to drive through salt water, and it's bad for the road because it's going to undermine the road, and sooner or later that road is going to deteriorate. So those are the kind of conditions we don't want to see. We can't put up with, and to keep our roads accessible. So we tried to figure out, how do we go ahead and rank all these 300 miles of roads once you got that engineering analysis cranking? How are we going to do it? Do we just going to look the amount of water on the road, which is, what everybody tends to think. But if you do that and just look at the amount of water on the road, you might be prioritizing roads that maybe don't get a lot of use. So maybe a road might have a foot or two of water on the road, but maybe there's only, very small numbers of people. So we have to look at the investment that we would be making for a small number of people versus maybe the same level investment for a road that serves a lot more people. So we divided this whole vulnerability study for roadways into two separate things. We have the vulnerability assessment that includes these type of things, the groundwater clearance, which is number one. So when your seas rise, your groundwater clearance rises also. And that's going to affect the way you dispose of the stormwater that falls on the road. You're not going to maybe be able to have outfalls. You might have to do injection wells. Number two is, of course, the amount of water on the road, the surface inundation. Number three is storm surge. That's important because down here in the Keys, we're definitely going to get storm surge. And number four is, as seas continue to rise, that's going to mean more surface wave impact to the existing roads or to elevated roads. And number five, you heard me talk about, its existing pavement condition. So as our roads here see increases levels of water for longer periods of time during the year, that's going to impact the pavement condition. So these all are part of the vulnerability assessment step one phase. Then we jump to the next phase, which is what I call the people score, and that's the criticality assessment. So we take that score from the previous screen that you saw, the vulnerability score, and we add it into these other types, like the number of people that are on the road. We call it number of residential units, and whether there's critical infrastructure on the road, such as hospitals or fire stations or other critical infrastructure, perhaps schools. And that will help, these type of things will help increase the score for some of the roads that are maybe a little tiny less vulnerable. But anyway, so you have this double criteria here. So you're getting the most efficient use of your resources when you're looking at ranking the roads. And here's some more. We also look at, under the criticality assessment, we look at the amount of commercial buildings, and then we get into the environment too, whether there's threatened and endangered species, wetlands and natural habitats, and whether the roadway functions as an evacuation route. Of course, US 1 is our highway that functions as an evacuation route, but there are other neighborhood roads that lead through several neighborhoods at a time that might also function in that same capacity. Okay, so this is kind of how we do the overall process. We took the scores from vulnerability step one, all of those things of roadway surface, the amount of water on the road, the groundwater clearance. We assigned them weighting percentages. And of course, the most important was the amount of water on the road, but these other ones all have lesser ones. Storm surge, surface wave, existing pavement. And we assigned a score for that to every section of mile of road. Then we carried it over to column two, where we now look at the criticality factors, which is the human factors. And we look at number of people and, whether there's a hospital or a fire station on the road, and then all these other things related to the environment. And then that comes up with the total score. And this is how we ranked our roads to determine which ones need to be elevated, when, and how high. And so we took this initial, we ranked all 311 miles of roads, but we wanted to move forward with, what is a design going to look like? What's a road elevation going to look like in the woodsy area of Big Pine versus maybe a more suburban area of Key Largo? Versus, Sugarloaf, it could be very different in different areas. We have very narrow roadways in some neighborhoods. We have wider roadways in other ones. And we have many other constrictions, like whether we have, a park next to us or whatever. So there's lots of different things. So when we wanted to move forward with conceptual designs, we had to limit, the number of roadway segments we were looking at. So we said, let's take the top 25%. Once we got through that phase one and phase two ranking, and now let's move on with the conceptual design. And even when we did that, it was still spread out. You can see these circles here that was still spread out through the entire Keys. So we got a good representative sampling. Okay, and so when we're looking at this roadway vulnerability study, you can see that graph to the right. when you're thinking, when I think in roads, I'm thinking, oh, roads either going to be all vulnerable or all high. And it's not the case. You can see here in this very colorful graph that green and the reds, they show you the different levels of the road. So the green is like a little higher and drier. The yellows and the reds are a little lower and wetter. So when you're looking at road adaptation projects for this particular area, and it's going to be throughout the Keys, you're going to look at, does the whole road need to be elevated or only portions of it, and how is that all going to occur? So that's why it's very, very important to have very accurate road elevation. That's what we got from the mobile LiDAR. So when you're doing these engineering calculations on these segments of roads that need to be elevated, you're not over designing, because then you're spending too much money before you have to, and you're not under designing, because then you're not protecting against the levels of water that are coming. So that's how how this all works. Roadway elevation accuracy is of utmost importance. You got to have that good quality data, or your recommendations for what to us is an almost $2 billion program are not going to be accurate. That's why we're comfortable with what we did, because we took our time, spent the money, and got really good quality data. You cannot cut corners on data when you're looking at this multi-billion-dollar program. And so now we went to the year, as I said, we went to the year 2045, because that's a standard useful life, and that's what we're looking at. Okay, so let me go on to the next slide. So when we're looking at, what's going to work where, I said, so we have, some woodsy areas in some of our lower keys where you have very winding, narrow roads. Maybe some more of our suburban areas have wider roads, but not necessarily true. So we have all kind of these different road designs. And when you're looking at what a road elevation looks like, you look at all these different things. What's the future water levels there? How are we going to get rid of the water that falls on these roads? What's the existing ground elevations? If we're at ground level 0, that's going to, a roadway elevation there might look different than a roadway, ground level 1.5, for instance. We have to look at safety. When you're elevating roads, you got to watch how you make them wider so you don't just fall off the edge. Accessibility, it's that whole walkability, drivability, bikeability. How are we going to ensure we live in a very beautiful paradise down here? We have a lot of outdoor activities. Are people going to be able to still walk down the roads and things like that? Utility impacts, are we going to need to raise the utility poles? Right-of-way impacts, are we going to need to use driveways or purchase right-of-way acquisitions if we have to make a wider road when we're already in this narrow environment? And then how are we going to get rid of, that's the expensive part, that last bullet down there is how are we going to collect the storm water that falls on the roads? How are we going to treat it and carry it away? And that's where the really big dollar amounts come in, when you have to build those big pump stations to pump it and dispose of it. And so this is, you see the little doggy there on the right. This is what we're looking at when we're looking at all how to do these designs. It's very important that you build in the people factor along with the engineering calculations and the science. It all works together. So what other impacts are we looking at? Of course, we're looking at our environmental and permitting. You have to be able to get the projects permitted. We're looking at our cost estimates. You heard me talk about that 1.8 billion. We do our financial analysis for the segments to ensure that we're getting the most bang for our buck. And so maybe some of the roads that are maybe most vulnerable to having water on the roads, they might not be the first to be elevated. If there are other roads that have more people on them and also vulnerable, it might be more bang for the buck to start with those neighborhoods. And then, of course, the impact to the residents in terms of ability to drive as a wide width and ability to walk and bike and things like that. We look at, of course, opportunities for green engineering. Where can we build parks or earthen berms and things like that? And these stormwater areas, maybe not a lot of opportunity down here, but we're sure going to try to build in as many as we can if possible. But because we're already so limited in our road space and the type of geography we have down here, that core rock, maybe not a lot of opportunities, but we're definitely looking at trying to incorporate as much as we can. And anywhere there's already an existing bicycle lane or shoulder areas, that's going to remain as is where it is. We're not going to mess with that. Of course, if we can add new bike lanes or whatever, if we do elevate a road or at least maintain walkability, that's at the top of our list. Okay, so the work to develop our flood mitigation implementation strategies, this is where the kind of the policy piece comes in. If we can't afford to elevate all the roads, what are we going to do? We probably hear Aaron talk a little bit about this after me. We look at differing levels of service, our case studies about natural hazards. How are we going to maintain roads if we elevate them? Are we obligated to the same level of maintenance as before? And what if there's water on the roads? All things like this, our regulatory requirements and our funding. And finally, when you're looking at terms of overall resilience, you see here these lines here. Let me, I don't know what's going to happen here. Let me just see what I can get. Just give me a second here. So the yellow ones, as you see, just because you elevate a road doesn't stop the water from coming in. It just stops it from getting on the roads, but it still can get into private yards and residences, as you see here. So the yellow lines are where kind of where they, by the year 2045, where we'll see sea level rise in this one neighborhood. Then by the blue ones are, excuse me, the blue is 2025, and then you add in the yellow for 2035, and then by 2045 is the red. So you can see we have a lot of additional access water coming in through even more ports. As the levels of sea continue to rise, you're going to see higher and higher levels of water in yards. So what do you do about that? That's private property. I mean, if houses are underwater, it's not going to do any good to have elevated roads. So that's where this whole overall resilience idea comes in. So the county comes in and does our part for the roads elevation, but then we have to work with the private property owners, and in terms of policies and like, what are we going to help them do, or what are we going to allow to do? Are we going to allow thousands of yards to be filled in? Are we going to help with that? What about, you know, driveways? Are they going to be elevated? Our backyard's going to have seawalls? So these are all these types of policy type of discussions that we're going to need to come up with. So we get to that unit on the right where we have true resilience in terms of public infrastructure, private infrastructure together to get the whole unified resilience in terms of overall Keys resilience. And I believe that adds, so it's a kind of a wrap up here. We are in the middle of wrapping up our project here. In the next 2 weeks, we're going to present to our October commission about what some of these conceptual designs look like. Maybe come back in January for a final wrap up and do some outreach to our residences and see what they think about this whole program. And then we're going to hopefully move on to help the municipalities with their thing. If you're interested in what this program is, you can go to keysroadsplan.com. Lots of good information there. If you want to contact us, you can, but that completes my presentation for the day. And thank you, Erin. I apologize for the technical difficulties.
Oh, no worries. We definitely appreciate your presentation today, Rhonda, in Delray Beach, and kind of learning from where Monroe County is at. It's probably one of the most in-depth case studies that I know of in the state, where you are using that good, strong technical data that Rhonda described, translating that into a process and effectively translating that further into policy response and decision making from the local government. So it's always helpful to have that kind of case study and analysis that you see across various local governments. And I know Rhonda makes these presentations both nationally and across the state. So we appreciate you giving us that time today.
Sure.
I'm going to go ahead and kind of take this to the next step and talk a little bit about some of the law and the policy and the other things that are happening across the state right now with regard to climate change planning and you know, pardon the terrible pun here, but where the rubber meets the road in terms of decision-making process and how to integrate this stuff into comprehensive plans and things that other local governments are considering across the state. So kind of building off of Rhonda's presentation here. Okay, so we are boaters in my family, and these are shots of the city of Delray Beach along the Intercoastal Waterway and some of the work that's being done in that Marina Way kind of historic city marina district that Kent was referring to earlier, and what it looks like from the water side of the equation, and you know how low the land potentially is, and what those impacts are that we see during the king tide season, which is upon us. It's that time of the year, so people may be seeing some flooding, but the city of Delray Beach is already starting to work on some of these issues, and I'm sure Kent will be referencing some of that when he makes some concluding remarks. Florida policy on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change we do have a lot in the law and the Florida statutes and the policy regarding this. Even most recently, this legislative session, we got the new Resilient Florida program. I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail on what that program is. Suffice it to say that it standardizes vulnerability assessments for local governments and provides access to granting funds for both planning and projects, which is desperately needed by local governments as they start confronting these issues and formulating their responses, like Rhonda referenced. And I know both the city of Delray Beach and Monroe County are pursuing grant applications in that Resilient Florida program. And so one of those policies also is the concept known as adaptation action areas, where a local government can identify a vulnerable area within its jurisdiction, create policies related to further planning or prioritizing funding for infrastructure needs in those areas, and create maps identifying where those areas are. And there are about 10 or 12 local governments across the state that have actually utilized this voluntary tool in the Florida statutes in their comprehensive plans to identify these adaptation action areas. And so I recently completed some work with Rhonda in Monroe County and developed an approach for adaptation action areas, which the county is going to consider further on down the line in its comprehensive plan. And instead of developing one type of adaptation action area, we looked at 3 different types of adaptation action areas. And this was a similar approach that we took with a multi-jurisdictional study that Delray was a part of, and a vulnerability assessment right here in Palm Beach County. And the idea is that the policies that you would include within the comprehensive plan are different when you're talking about infrastructure or residential neighborhoods or natural resources. Therefore, you would have 3 different types of these adaptation action areas and map series that would go along with them in the comprehensive plan. And so for Monroe County, for infrastructure and assets, we identified 7 adaptation action areas. Residential neighborhoods were 15, and natural resources 10 areas. And those are the most critical natural resources within Monroe County and the Florida Keys to potentially protect based on some vulnerability mapping that we did within the community and know where those habitats are and critical species and that type of thing. And so this is an example of what those maps look like. Now, those pink dots on that map are people's homes. And based on the modeling that we've done, there will be some level of permanent inundation at those properties by 2040. This isn't, that's 19 years from now. And as that year approaches, those properties will be seeing more and more inundation. It may not be permanent over the entire year, but we can model and we can predict where people will be impacted. And so where you have a large aggregation of those pink dots, we put a line on a map around that area and called it an adaptation action area for the purposes of prioritizing funding and further planning at that down kind of scaled version at the neighborhood level. This is one of the natural areas or natural resources adaptation action areas. You can tell that the areas in pink are where you have accumulations of threatened and endangered species, and this would be potential areas that we would want to make sure that we protect. And then finally, infrastructure and assets, where we can get right down to various drainage structures and identify ones that are going to be impacted. Where you see a red circle around it, that's a drainage structure. That's a catch basin that is going to be impacted by future sea level rise inundation. And so this is the map series that supports that. Additionally, Florida has what's known as peril of flood legislation, and what it requires, as opposed to adaptation action areas, which is a voluntary designation. The peril of flood legislation requires local governments to address these 6 elements within their comprehensive plans. And basically, what the state's Department of Economic Opportunity wants to see in these comprehensive plan provisions is how you are going to address future flood risk within your community. And so about 50% of local governments have complied with this legislation, but the importance is that DEP, through its new Resilient Florida program, has money for local governments to undertake the necessary data collection and analysis and comply with those peril of flood requirements within state law. The important thing about that is the vulnerability assessments that are now required to access this grant funding under the Resilient Florida program, those provisions also want to see local governments undertake these peril of flood amendments also, and it is a requirement to access those funds if you are undertaking a vulnerability assessment. Also, we have to look at other regulations and things within local governments' codes and comprehensive plans. For instance, the road abandonment ordinance. Road abandonment is code for retreat. Local governments may decide that there are some areas based on the types of analysis that Rhonda talked about, that it just doesn't make financial sense to elevate certain roads. Maybe the road only serves one or two property owners, and that just does not have like a big effect with that people factor that Rhonda was talking about. And so looking at that road abandonment procedure as a tool for local governments to say, we are not going to continue to fight Mother Nature in that particular area. It just makes sense to just maintain the road, not actually elevate it. Design standards by the Florida Department of Transportation and what that means. Local governments can deviate from those FDOT design standards. For instance, maybe the local government wants to undertake higher elevation in their road requirements and design criteria in the code, and deviating and using those design exceptions for FDOT would be a way to do that. Water management districts issue permits for drainage systems, but they do not regulate sea level rise per se, but they do ask questions about the functionality of your drainage system and how that system will function, knowing that there's going to be saltwater sea level rise inundation. Will there be enough capacity to pump water, precipitation, or rainwater off of a road? And the water management districts have begun asking those questions within the permitting process. Stormwater criteria is important. Quality and quantity of water is related. And so when you see sea level rise and tidal inundation, for instance, during king tides, come up and inundate roads, at some point when the low tide comes and all of that water comes off of that road, all of that yucky stuff that was on the road also goes into our nearshore waters. So looking at the design and the functionality of those stormwater systems in the face of tidal flooding is really important. And then other issues that we've got right now regarding wetlands regulation, and if local governments do receive state dollars for projects, they now have to undertake what's called a SLIP, or a sea level impact projection study, to make sure that that state investment is going to withstand time in terms of future sea level rise and flood risk. Real estate disclosures is an important area of the law that's kind of evolving now. And what the language that you see here on my slide is the basic real estate disclosure related to flooding in a Florida real estate contract. This is all that is required. And you will not see the words sea level rise related flooding, or rain flooding, or storm surge. And I will tell you that most realtors interpret this provision to mean, yeah, we all know that we're subject to hurricanes and storm surge. And so, the property isn't going to flood in that kind of situation. So what we really see is disclosures related to flood insurance and that type of thing. But the real estate community really isn't disclosing and talking about future flood risk related to sea level rise. And so the question is, should some of those disclosure laws be changed so that buyers of properties are more aware of what that flood risk potentially is? And hold on to that issue, because I will tell you, well, that's a little weird. Sorry about the animations there. But the important thing to remember is that local governments also have the authority that they can strengthen those flood-related disclosures. And Leon County is one of those local governments that has done just that. And they have a broader real estate disclosure requirement that if you have knowledge that a property has experienced flooding or is otherwise flood prone, you've got to disclose that. And flooding is broad. Flooding could mean rain flooding, it could mean storm surge flooding, and it could also mean sea level rise. So this broader disclosure requirement is probably going to result in more people being aware of what the flood risk on that property actually is. Other evolving laws and regulations, for instance, Broward County, they require future groundwater conditions to be factored into their permitting process for land development. Freeboard is the concept that local governments can require elevation of structures higher than just being at ground level or base flood elevation. And so there are some local governments that look at requiring construction to be at a higher level. And it's important to align these freeboard provisions with height elevation requirements. For instance, a local government may say, hey, we're not going to allow you to build structures over 30 feet high. Well, if you're encouraging people to build up to get them out of the floodplain, you may want to relax some of those height provisions that allow, for instance, an exceedance of that 30 foot, 1 foot for every foot that you elevate or something like that. The city of Key West is one local government that has addressed that issue in its code. And I believe Monroe County has provisions on the books as well. And then I've also talked about the relationship between water quality and stormwater design and water quantity. Seawall regulations are a hot topic right now, and I think Kent may talk about that in some of his concluding remarks. Here are just some examples from the city of Miami Beach and Broward County regarding the fact that they are requiring shoreline structures and seawalls to be at a higher level. Broward County also requires one of those disclosures that I talked about earlier, that the property is located in a tidally influenced area, and that if you buy the property, you will be noticed of that fact, and that the property has to come into compliance with those new seawall regulations so that people know that they may have to make a significant investment in upgrading their seawall at some point to comply with that. Buyers should know that. Funding strategies for resilience. There is no one funding strategy, and local governments are going to be struggling and using all one or multiple of these funding resources. And assessments is going to be one of those tools that local governments utilize also to make sure that they are tailoring the cost of these types of adaptation projects to those people that are actually going to benefit from them directly. Under the no good deed goes unpunished column, the city of Miami Beach right now is being sued by property owners that do not like the assessment methodology for how they are funding some of their stormwater and road elevation projects. That case is in active litigation right now, and it's really important to understand the effect of that case and what it means as to how you develop a methodology to assess people to pay for these projects. The village of Key Biscayne also was the recipient of a lawsuit where a property owner challenged a bond question that was put in front of the voters to pay $100 million for bonds and the debt service on those bonds for resiliency projects. That case has concluded, and the village did prevail, upholding the bonds that were put in front of the voters. So the issue of people not being happy with the decisions that local governments are making with regard to adaptation projects and how they are paying for those projects is going to be something that will be hotly contested because not every property owner is going to be the recipient of a direct adaptation project. And what is that going to mean in the long term for the local government's ability to be able to pay for some of these projects like Rhonda's talking about? There is no way that Monroe County is going to escape the fact that a $2 billion program is going to require some investment of the constituents in the community through some type of bond or through some type of assessment. The question is how much, and what's that relationship between what the local government pays and what the individuals that benefit from that project are going to pay. some of the big legal and policy issues are going to continue, where people are either suing the local government to make sure that the local government undertakes an adaptation project, or they may not like the way an adaptation project has been designed or conceived of, or who's going to actually benefit from it. So we will probably see more of those cases popping up with, people that are either happy or unhappy with the local government's decision-making process for their adaptation strategy. So just talking a little bit about that, this is the king tides last year in the town of Lantana where I live. This is our local boat ramp, and obviously it's really difficult to launch your boat and go out in it if the entire ramp is under salt water for some level of time. And you can see there that king tide flooding, how close it gets to that building, which is, there's a great little breakfast cafe in there called Kona. And they have to deal with this because their entire parking lot serving that building is underwater for parts of the year when we have a really bad king tide in Lantana. There is no case law right now on what local governments are looking at in terms of negligence or liability related to sea level rise, but we do have a lot of cases out there in terms of what infrastructure liability has existed for local governments to this date. There are negligence lawsuits, there are nuisance lawsuits, and then there are people that are unhappy with a local government's response for sea level rise and feel that their property value has been taken or not by a specific local government action, or the fact that the local government is not acting fast enough to undertake adaptation and protect properties. So I'm winding down right now, and I'm going to turn it over to Kent for some concluding remarks. But my forecast as to what's going to happen with the legislative session, which is earlier this year, it's about to start. Committees are actually starting now. And the Champlain Towers disaster begs some very interesting questions in terms of what do we do for our buildings and how do we inspect them? And, it really raises the overall infrastructure kind of question overall. And so it'll be interesting to see what the response is by the legislature, whether that response is just procedural related to condo associations and inspections and that type of thing, or are we going to have a larger question about the vulnerability of our building stock and the proximity of those buildings to the coast that may be vulnerable to future sea level rise. The state has definitely gotten more active, and we applaud them for passing the Resilient Florida legislation last year. I foresee that there will probably be some more glitches to be fixed with that legislation this year, but the idea that there is money that is going to be flowing to local governments is an important concept. So it will be interesting to see what we get out of the legislative session related to that. Flood insurance reform is becoming a very hot topic. We keep band-aiding the National Flood Insurance Program. And so it will be interesting to see if we actually get real change with the National Flood Insurance Program. We've been having these extensions of the program to keep it functioning as is. And so that is a very hot topic at the federal level about what people pay for flood insurance, and are they paying the actual risk associated with a property. That's a concept known as risk rating 2.0. And how will that impact people's flood insurance bills? That is a really important issue, especially when so many people live proximate to the coast. And so that, from a national policy perspective, is something that's definitely important and that will hit people's pocketbooks. Will we see more litigation as local governments struggle, or not so much struggle, but start down the path of adaptation? Absolutely. There are going to be winners and losers, and people that are going to be happy or unhappy with those governmental decisions. And so just to wind up, again, this is another shot from the city of Delray Beach, and I use it to kind of demonstrate what we're looking at. The guy in the middle there may have elevated his seawall, but his neighbors didn't. And so that is not something that is going to make that property resilient overall. And so that's why we look at these types of policies within the code and seawall elevations and those types of things to make sure that our buildings and our properties are protected to the extent that they can be. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I am going to shut up, and I'm going to turn it over to Kent, who gave us this opportunity to present to you today. And hopefully you've been able to learn some new things about what the state and what various local governments are doing and how on top of it, the Florida Keys is with their adaptation response. So thank you. Kent, take it away.
Thank you so much, Erin. So thank you to Erin Deedy for putting together this session. Thank you so much to Rhonda Haig and Monroe County for participating. And this is a very important piece of the overall climate and art event. There was a certain picture that we were trying to build. And so I'd like to describe how that fits in and summarize the session also. So as you can see, there is a lot of activity that's going on at state level and down to local levels also. There are policies and rules in place that are setting planning requirements that all of the municipalities and counties have to go through. There are design standards and new design standards that are being put in place for items like stormwater. And there's also funding and insurance requirements. So throughout the whole administrative area, there are a lot of things that are going on. I think it's great for us to have an opportunity to see what Monroe County is doing in great detail, because it gives us a view into the future of what Delray Beach and other communities are going to be seeing also. The vulnerability assessment that Monroe County did and the great detail on roadways, which again, everyone has, the effect on access and homes and flooding. Those are very helpful for people to understand what climate change is and how it's going to affect their daily lives. For Delray Beach, we have also gone through a vulnerability assessment, as Erin referred to, and there were other kinds of assets. So critical assets for potable water, for wastewater systems that still are going to need to function in the future. For the city hall, where administrative activities for the city occurs, police stations, schools, economic centers. All of these areas need to go through a similar kind of detailed assessment like you have seen earlier in the presentation there. And in other sessions, if you get a chance, I hope that you'll take a look at the other sessions for climate and art. We talked about planting of trees. Those will address the extreme heat part of climate change. Also, the seawall construction that you saw earlier this morning, or can see on the live stream that we did along the Intracoastal Waterway, and the Seawall Ordinance that will go before the City Commission as far as setting those elevations and timeframes for constructing going forward. All of those kinds of activities address climate change, and they're a part of the daily lives. And it will affect the community and the viability of the community going forward. So in wrapping up the session, a message that we were really trying to get across this year is that climate change is real. There's been a lot of discussion about climate change. It is happening, and it can be scary, but once you look into what at the state level and the local level, counties and our partners are doing, there is planning in place. There are construction activities. There are things that we can do. And I hope that you'll continue to tune in to see how your community is addressing climate change and how Delray Beach and other communities are going to be viable going into the future. So again, thank you to our partners, Erin and Rhonda, and I hope you'll tune in to the other sessions.
Thank you for having us.